Que nos cubrirá de glorias, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Que nos cubrirá de glorias, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Luchamos contra los moros, rumbala, rumbala, rumbala. Luchamos contra los moros, rumbala, rumbala, rumbala. Mercenarios y fascistas, ay Carmela, ay Carmela.
Madrid, Spain, November 1936. You sit at your desk in the War Ministry, looking at the letter in front of you as bombs pound the city outside and the whole building shakes. You are General Jose Miaja, and you have just been given a virtual death sentence, ordered to lead the defence of Madrid against the nationalist armies. Ever since the Army of Africa reached the mainland, they have been unstoppable. Gruesome atrocities left in their wake. Fear hangs like a dark cloud over Madrid. You ring bells, but no one comes. You try to ring your commanders, but virtually no one answers. You eventually get through to someone, but he laughs drunkenly and jeers. "This is Franco's city, old man. Flee like the rest of us." Realising you're doing no good here in this abandoned mausoleum of a ministry, you head outside to get an official car to the front lines. There's only one left, and it is already speeding towards the exit. You shout out at the driver to stop. An unshaven private sticks two fingers up at you and shouts, "This is Franco's city now," while driving off. Suddenly, a German plane swoops down towards you, the terrifying scream of his engines filling the air. Taking cover, you can only watch as it shoots up the fleeing car, its bullets turning it into Swiss cheese. The car crashes into a wall, and no one emerges from the wreckage. It feels like all hope is gone, but then, deep in your soul, the embers of resistance ignite. If you're going to die, then it will be with a gun in your hand. You will prove them all wrong. The city will hold. Spotting a bicycle, you start riding towards the front lines. You have a city to defend. They shall not pass. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebildet, wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In the last episode, the military rose up to overthrow the Republic, but while they succeeded in some areas, in others it failed miserably. With Spain now split into nationalist and Republican zones, civil war became inevitable. While the democracies hid behind neutrality and refused to help the Republic, Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany flooded the nationalists with aid. Now Franco is advancing relentlessly on the capital. If it falls, the Republican cause is over. The battle for Madrid is about to begin. In the first week of October 1936, the triumph of the rebels seemed inevitable. Republican militias fell back in demoralised retreat, terrified of the Moorish troops of the Army of Africa in particular. German Heinkels and Italian Fiats dominated the skies, bombing and strafing at will. In the north, the nationalists captured the border town of Irun, despite fanatical resistance by Republican fighters that left the city a burning ruin, and then seized San Sebastian as well. The Basque region and Asturia were now cut off from their French supply lines. On the Aragon front, the Barcelona militias, which had performed so well in urban warfare, now failed to advance far or fast. This was despite facing a nationalist army that was crippled by a lack of ammunition. Even the legendary anarchist commander, Bonaventura Durruti, the so-called avenging angel of the poor, wreaked more havoc on his own side than on the enemy, eventually stalling in front of Saragossa. Tales of how his troops got lost as they didn't have maps and went home on weekends soon filtered around Spain. The Madrid front was the most worrying. Almost everyone assumed the capital was going to fall. General Mola, the chief plotter of the original coup attempt, boasted that he would soon drink coffee on Madrid's famous Gran Via. Over the airwaves, General Capo, in Seville, ranted that the Nationalists had agreed to the deaths of, quote, 3 or 4 million Spaniards, a tenth of whom would be from Madrid, to achieve their final triumph, end quote. If that failed to terrify the Republican defenders, he then sneered that the women of Madrid had been promised to the Moorish troops, and that they would soon all have, quote, little fascists in their bellies, end quote. A weird atmosphere hung over the city, a mixture of fear, defiance, and disbelief. Placards, posters, and slogans were everywhere, proclaiming Madrid would be the tomb of fascism and the Verdun of democracy. The government had fallen, and the socialist leader, Largo Caballero, the self-proclaimed Spanish Lenin, had come to power. In the build-up to the Civil War, he had played a large role in the polarization of Spain, pushing the terrified middle classes into the general's arms with his bloodthirsty rhetoric and calls for revolution. Well, he had finally gotten his revolution, but he was no Lenin. A bullying autocrat to his staff, who claimed that he had, quote, the smooth face of a monk and the glinting grey eyes of a power-hungry tycoon, which, like those of Philip II, make your blood run cold, end quote. He was also a useless war leader. He discouraged the digging of trenches because, I kid you not, it was unworthy for Spaniards to fight in such a way. When he was eventually forced to allow trenches to be dug, he forbade socialist-aligned workers from cooperating with anarchists, terrified they would defect. He did at least find some support from the outside world, even if it did come with plenty of strings. Help was coming from the man of steel himself, Joseph Stalin. Throughout its existence, the Soviet Union portrayed its help to the Spanish resistance as a disinterested attempt to stop fascism. But with Uncle Joe, nothing was ever that simple. He wanted the Spanish to do his fighting in Europe, just as the Chinese were doing in Asia against Imperial Japan, while simultaneously taking the Republic for everything he could get. He sent much-needed weapons to the beleaguered Largo government, but they wouldn't be free. The Spanish had to buy them with enough gold from the Republic's vaults to pave Red Square. At a drunken banquet with his lackeys, Stalin gloated that, quote, the Spaniards will never see their gold again, just as one cannot see one's own ears, end quote. Stalin even meddled with the exchange rate so he could overcharge the Republic for the weapons. The quality of these arms also varied enormously. Rifles and field guns were often in a bad state and obsolete. One batch of guns of Tsarist vintage were known as the batteries of Catherine the Great. The 10 different sorts of rifles came from 8 countries and required rounds of 6 different calibers. Many of them had been captured during the First World War, and some of them were 50 years old. The T-26 and later BT-5 tanks, on the other hand, were entirely modern and better than the opposing German models. The aircraft, although modern by Soviet standards, was soon outfought and outflown by the new German aircraft, which came into service the following year. With Soviet weaponry and advisors pouring in, a secret counterattack against the nationalist offensive on Madrid was organised. Well, it was meant to be secret, but Largo decided to pre-announce it over the radio. Quote, listen to me, comrades. Tomorrow, 29th of October at dawn, our artillery and our tanks will open fire on the enemy. Then our air force will appear, dropping bombs on them and machine-gunning them. At the moment of the air attack, our tanks will attack the enemy's most vulnerable flank, sowing panic in their ranks. Now we have tanks and aircraft. Forward, comrades of the front, heroic sons of the working people. Victory is ours." End quote. The Nationalists now knew they were coming. Well done, Largo. Well done. 15 T-26 tanks lumbered out of Madrid, crewed by Soviet instructors and their Spanish trainees. The metal monsters storm across the battlefield, lethal bullets and shells spewing out of them. The cavalry charges towards the tanks, their guns blazing. But soon shells smash into their ranks, horses and men disappearing in a bloody mess. As the cavalry retreats, they are mown down by the tanks' machine guns. You're a Moroccan soldier fighting for Franco, and the advance on Madrid has just turned from a pleasant joyride into a full-on battle. A tank lumbers towards your position and opens fire. As an explosion showers you in dirt, you yell to your friend Mohammed, "We have to retreat! We stand no chance against that thing!" But Mohammed smiles back with an excited expression on his face. "I have an idea. I need you to distract it." He is filling empty beer bottles with petrol and then stuffing a rag in after. You look at it mystified, but agree. You fire your rifle at the tank as you run to a nearby rock for cover, your bullets bouncing uselessly off its armour. Its machine gun opens up, showering your position with bullets. Then its turret slowly swings around and faces towards you. Suddenly, Mohammed appears with one of the beer bottles, the rag on top now on fire, and he throws it at the tank. As the bottle smashes, fire spreads rapidly across the tank's armour. 2 more bottles follow, and soon the tank has turned into a bonfire. The hatch opens and a burning crewman leaps out, trying to put out the flames that are consuming him. Lifting your rifle, you fire once, putting him out of his misery. This now forgotten offensive outside Madrid is where the Molotov cocktail was invented. It wouldn't get its name until the future winter war between the USSR and Finland, but Moroccan soldiers used them to take out 3 of the Republic's tanks. As the tank offensive stalled, they soon found out they were on their own. The infantry was meant to be reinforcing them, but they were nowhere to be seen. What was going on? Amazingly, they had gotten tired following the tanks and had decided to have a sit-down and a break. After a while, they realised that the tanks had disappeared over the horizon, and rather than racing to catch up, they decided to go home. While this farce was going on at the front, Red Terror was raging behind the lines. Spy mania had gripped the city, fueled by General Mola's notorious comment that he would take Madrid with 4 columns on the outside and a 5th column of secret supporters hidden inside the capital. Actually, this didn't exist. Those nationalists still inside were hiding in fear for their lives. But now paranoia ran wild, fueling bloodshed and chaos. As a wave of executions and massacres spread across Madrid, newly released criminals from the prisons added to the chaos. The most terrible incident was the massacre of over 1,000 nationalist prisoners in the model prison, who were taken off in red double-decker buses and shot just outside the city. A horrified and disgusted President Azana lamented that, quote, "he did not want to preside over a republic of assassins," end quote. As the gunshots from the executions echoed out, nationalist planes began pounding the city, and refugees flooded in from the countryside with their livestock, telling horrific tales of nationalist atrocities. Largo decided bold leadership was needed. He fled. His government evacuated to Valencia. The rats abandoned the sinking ship so fast that they made almost comical errors. Largo left sealed letters with secret orders for his 2 leading generals, but put them in the wrong envelopes. It was lucky they decided to open them together. His officials also took with them vital information about the sites of ammunition dumps in the capital. The defenders were reduced to sending out scouting parties to find them again. The man who drew the short straw to lead the capital's defence was the fat, bald and bespectacled General Jose Miaja. Ernest Hemingway memorably described him as, quote, brave and as dumb as a bull, end quote. He was an odd supporter of the Republic, a conservative Catholic army officer who had served in the Rif Wars in Morocco. If there was a key demographic for a fanatical nationalist, this was it. But he hadn't been included in the coup and was stationed in Madrid, where it had failed miserably, and this seems to have been enough to keep him loyal. Still, the situation he found himself in was just as dire as we saw at the start of the podcast. He had few men, few arms, and had to negotiate the streets of Madrid by bicycle, as all the official cars were gone. He actually had an accident after crashing into a herd of sheep, wandering the streets with their refugee peasant owners. By sheer force of will, he began organising a defence of Madrid, famously yelling out that, quote, I want those who stay with me to know how to die, end quote. Madrid seemed to come alive when the government fled, helped by a massive communist propaganda campaign. At huge rallies, over the airwaves, and in newspaper headlines, the slogan, all out to the barricades, the enemy is across the river, echoed out. Cinemas showed Soviet classic films like the battleship Potemkin, while in the Plaza de Atocha, a large placard warned, quote, in Badajoz, the fascists shot 2,000. If Madrid falls, they will shoot half the city, end quote. Rebel atrocities and promises of brutal retaliation had actually backfired, inspiring the people of Madrid to resist instead. Granite blocks were torn up from the streets and used to build barricades in the grey slums of Carabanchel. Trenches were dug among the rolling woods of the Casa de Campo. Volunteers streamed to the city's defence, often in hastily formed companies based on profession. They had companies made up of bakers, graphic designers, and even barbers. Women took over traditionally male roles and boiled oil to use against Franco's Moorish troops. Despite all this, no one would have bet on them defeating the Nationalists as Franco's men reached southwestern Madrid. The international press was already describing the last hours of Madrid. Several French journalists even sent details of the capital's capture so as to beat their rivals to the story. Leon Balbi wrote, quote, nothing can be done to prevent the evident truth. Madrid will be taken rapidly, and that it will be the final victory for the Nationalists, end quote. Portuguese radio gave vivid details of General Franco's triumphal entry, mounted on a white charger. Telegrams flooded into General Miaja's headquarters, preemptively congratulating Franco on his supposed triumph. Yet the defenders had hidden advantages. The Manzanares River ran through the heart of Madrid, a formidable natural barrier to the Nationalists reaching the city centre. The rebels were also heavily outnumbered and were worried about street fighting. On open ground they dominated, but if the fighting went house to house, they would lose all their advantages and take heavy casualties they couldn't afford. Perhaps most importantly, they failed to surround the city and cut off its supply lines. General Mola was in charge of taking Madrid, a clever move from the cautious Franco, who could blame his great rival if anything went wrong. To avoid street fighting, Mola planned to launch a diversionary assault in the slums of Carabanchel. With the defenders distracted, the real assault would fall on the vast former royal hunting grounds of the Casa del Campo to the west of Madrid. Smashing their way through here would avoid street fighting and would lead straight into the city centre. Yet all his planning would be for naught, as the defenders got a lucky break. A militia detachment came across a knocked-out Italian tank. Inside, they found the body of a nationalist captain, with the complete battle plan in his jacket pocket. Overnight, the bulk of the defenders' forces were sent to the Casa del Campo. Then, on the 8th of November, the Nationalists emerged from the woods, and the battle for Madrid began. As Franco's planes pounded the city, his troops walked into a wall of lead, the former royal forest becoming a bloody battleground, involving hand-to-hand fighting. On that awful day, it often seemed that the Nationalists would break through, especially when they captured some key bridges over the river. Just when it looked as though they would penetrate into the Plaza de España, a pistol-packing Miaja rallied his forces, quote, "Cowards! Cowards! Die in your trenches! Die with your General Miaja!" End quote. As the fighting raged on, the poorly armed and supplied defenders held the line. The seemingly invincible Army of Africa failed to break through. Republican morale soared, especially as famous reinforcements soon arrived. No part of the Spanish Civil War has been more mythologized than the international brigades. Foreigners from around the world coming to Spain to fight in brigades organized by the Soviet Union. I'll go into detail on them later in this episode, but for now, the first contingent arrived in Madrid. As they paraded down the Grand Via, locals mistook them for Russians and shouted out, "Viva Russia!" Compared to the Republican militias, they appeared like a real army. Dressed in khaki corduroy uniforms and tin helmets, carrying rifles that were not ancient blunderbusses. Their officers even had swords and revolvers, while the whole force appeared well drilled and disciplined. This was something of an illusion. They had been raced into combat before their training was complete. Still, they soon showed incredible bravery. On the 9th of November, the brigaders counterattacked the Nationalist left flank in the Casa del Campo, losing nearly half their men and retaking the northeastern part lost on the previous day, leaving piles of enemy dead under the trees. With the Nationalist assault stalled here, Mola changed his plan and attacked the slums of the Carabanchel. This was a bad idea. Fierce house-to-house fighting ensued in this working-class suburb, where the militias, on familiar ground, not only held back the Moors, but inflicted heavy casualties. With the Nationalists bogged down in the street fighting they had desperately wanted to avoid, Mola was concerned by the high casualty rates and the loss of experienced troops. Desperate to break the stalemate, he discovered a weak spot in the university city. This was the vast unfinished campus of Ciudad University, just to the north of the Casa del Campo. It was guarded by 3,000 men of the anarchist Durruti division, recently arrived from the Zaragoza front. As the communists and the anarchists didn't get on, they were not receiving Soviet aid, and were therefore very vulnerable. On the 19th of November, Durruti's men were pounded by nationalist bombers and artillery, while the infamous Spanish Foreign Legion lunged across the Manzanares River into the university city. Only 300 out of the original 3,000 men of the Durruti Brigade would survive the fighting. Durruti himself was killed, probably by accident, though his men blamed the communists. The bad blood between the anarchists and the communists would only grow, with terrible results for the Republic. The battle now raged around the half-built Fortress of Learning. A shell smashes into the ground nearby. While while machine gun fire rakes the street in front of you. Coming from the forbidding concrete block of a building up ahead. Your mother had dreams of you going to university, but this probably wasn't what she had in mind. Your commander runs over. That's the School of Architecture. It's filled with Franco's legionnaires. We've got to clear it out. Advance on my signal. As your comrades provide covering fire, you charge towards the building, bullets filling the air. A militiaman reaches the door, but a hail of bullets catches him in the chest, and he falls. Taking cover, you throw in grenades. Advancing into the school, you dive behind an overturned desk as more bullets come out of the smoke and dust. The militiaman behind you screams out and clutches his stomach. As the bullets stop thudding into the solid oak desk, you peer out and spot a swarthy legionary, reloading his rifle. He looks up, hate glaring out from his eyes as you fire bullets into his torso. As more militiamen arrive, you advance deeper into this now lethal fortress of learning. The brigaders manage to recapture the gutted red brick hall of philosophy, barricading themselves behind huge books of German metaphysics, Indian transcendentalism, and Encyclopædica Britannicas, which proved, one ironically remarked, quote, quite bulletproof, end quote. In other faculty buildings, Republican forces fought for floors and even rooms, sniping around doors and sending up hand grenades in lifts. Death arrived haphazardly, and there were hairbreadth escapes. In the uncompleted clinical hospital, 50 Moors died from eating experimental rabbits, hens and sheep, injected with germs. A shell splinter circumcised one foreign volunteer as, quote, neatly as a practiced rabbi, end quote. I bet that was painful. Soon, both sides were at a virtual stalemate yet again. Having failed to take the city, Franco ordered a change of plan. He could not risk losing more of his men in bloody street fighting. Instead, he resolved to pound the city into submission, ranting to a journalist that, quote, I will destroy Madrid rather than leave it to the Marxists, end quote. Madrid became what one American correspondent called, quote, a nightmare of slaughter and living horror, a seething hell which makes Dante's masterpiece a tame thing by comparison, end quote. During the day, the capital was obscured by clouds of smoke and dust. At night, it was lit up by incendiaries and fires. Bengal flares turned darkness into noon and transformed streets around the Grand Via into rivers of green flame. Nationalist planes deliberately targeted food queues. Civilians took refuge in the metro system or sheltered in dank cellars. They survived mainly on lentils, plus occasional meat wherever they could find it. Not everybody was suffering, however. As Orwell famously said in Animal Farm, everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. Soviet advisors, commissars, senior officers, and important party cadres lived the life of Riley in their luxurious and well-stocked base in Gaylord's Hotel. Cocaine and prostitutes were among the pleasures on offer. Only the wealthy Salamanca district was spared from the bombing, as it was seen as sympathetic to the Nationalists. Soon Salamanca was so packed that travelling through it was virtually impossible. Yet, just as the Luftwaffe would find out during the Battle of Britain, or the Allies when bombing Germany, all this carnage didn't break Madrid's will to resist. In fact, it strengthened it. Ordinary life carried on. In the cratered, glass-strewn Puerta del Sol, bootblacks, newsboys and vendors of lottery tickets continued to ply their trades. Shops boarded up their windows and adapted to the new circumstances. One shop, which used to deal in holy images, sold kneeling shepherds painted to look like militiamen taking aim instead. Tram lines and overhead cables were quickly repaired, and the service was maintained. In the Grand Via, christened the Avenue of Death, bars and cinemas kept up a ghostly existence before the curfew. The bombing campaign was so obviously a failure that in London, German representative Prince Otto von Bismarck derided British fears of air attacks, quote, "since you see what little harm they have done in Madrid." End quote. By the end of November, the struggle for Madrid had settled into a cold, hungry siege, punctuated by bombardment, air raids, and the occasional flare-up. In the Carabanchel, where the front line cut through the middle of streets, a strange, deadly struggle continued, with sniping, flamethrower attacks, and tunnelling under houses to lay dynamite. Though the fighting continued, it was clear that the Nationalist offensive had failed. A café on the Grand Via even reserved a table for General Mola, mocking his statement that he would soon be drinking coffee there. The Communists promoted Miaja as the hero of Madrid, giving him an idealized treatment in their press throughout the world. Miaja was thrilled and even became a party member to repay the compliment. This was really ironic, as only 4 years previously he had called for them all to be shot. Yet Miaja was too vain to realize he was being used as a figurehead to hide communist power. They now dominated Madrid, and their tentacles were spreading all over Republican Spain. In a sign of the times, they shot the imprisoned Falange leader, Primo de Rivera, without consulting Largo's government. Despite Largo's furious protests, there was nothing he could do about it. The communists had become a state within a state, the most powerful faction on the Republican side. A frustrated Franco became unhealthily obsessed with capturing Madrid. While a brave soldier and an excellent politician, he wasn't actually that good a general. He insisted to German General Wilhelm Faupel that, quote, "I will take Madrid, that all of Spain, including Catalonia, will fall into my hands, more or less without a fight." End quote. A bemused Faupel described the statement as, quote, "an estimate of the situation that I cannot describe as anything but frivolous." End quote. As Franco, Mola, and the gang go back to the drawing board, we're going to take a moment to explore the famous international brigades. On the 6th of October 1936, the 20-year-old English poet and communist John Cornford led a small group of young British men into the Gare d'Austerlitz station in Paris. Before them was an odd sight. The station was packed with similar groups of varying nationalities, all trying to act nonchalant and not mix with each other. To an outside observer, it was a surprisingly cosmopolitan group of passengers for a train ride into Spain. Yet this was no ordinary journey. This was the Red Express, and the passengers all wanted to fight for the Republic. Ironically, it wasn't until the train crossed over into Spain that they all realized they were there for the same purpose. Some came on their own accord. Others had received the call from Moscow. They were Poles in exile from their country's military regime, Hungarians fleeing from Admiral Horthy's dictatorship, Romanians escaping from the Iron Guard, and Yugoslavs avoiding the royalist police, thanks to a certain Josip Broz, better known as Marshal Tito, and his secret railway for dissidents. Even White Russians headed to Spain, hoping that service with the brigades would allow them to return home. The biggest contributors were France, Germany, and Italy. Later on, British, Canadian, Australian, and American volunteers flooded in. Because of the famous literary figures among them, history tends to portray the brigades as being full of educated middle-class intellectuals. Actually, they were mainly working class. What united them was a fear of fascism, and at least a sympathy for communism, if not enthusiastic support. For those brigaders from Germany, Italy, and East Europe, it was also about taking on the regimes at home through the battlefields of Spain. Hilariously, as they arrived at their base in Spain for training, national stereotypes were very much in evidence right from the beginning. The efficient Germans cleaned up the disgusting barracks and put up banners with the slogan, "We exalt discipline." The French volunteers became infamous for drinking wine and chasing Spanish girls. Many were soon out of action due to STIs, and the barracks was plastered with posters warning the volunteers to use protection. The Germans tried to impose discipline on them, but this didn't go down well. One Frenchman complained that, quote, "What kind of life is this? One isn't allowed to drink wine or go to the brothel, and one has to get up early." End quote. Spoken like a true Frenchman. Those from the Anglosphere overdid it on foreign wine and food, soon coming down with rampant diarrhea. Good to know some things never change. From the New World, the most famous units were the Abraham Lincoln and George Washington battalions, made up of American volunteers, and the Mackenzie Papineau or Mac Paps battalion from Canada. From the Old World, it was the Garibaldi battalion, made up of Italians, and the British battalion and the Falman battalion of Germans, named after a particularly dour and brutal German communist leader. They were used as shock troops of the Republic, and they paid a heavy price. They regularly suffered 30% casualties. The norm in the Civil War was 10%. Yet while they were incredibly brave, they did steal the spotlight from the Spanish troops. Communist propaganda was so focused on the brigades that the British ambassador in Madrid claimed only foreign troops were defending the city. In reality, they only made up 5% of the Republican forces. That said, as the battle for Madrid began to heat up again in early 1937, they were about to enter into legend. The Nationalists now tried what they should have done at the start of November. Rather than wasting soldiers in urban warfare, they would focus on surrounding Madrid and cutting off the city's supply lines. The capital would be starved into submission. On the 29th of November 1936, they launched the first of 3 attacks on the Coruna Road to the northwest of Madrid, hoping to achieve a breakthrough. Far from being a war-winning move, they turned into bloody stalemates with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The conditions for the troops were truly miserable as the weather became biting cold. The Republican militias had to dig trenches with bayonets in their own hands in the stony Spanish soil. They often couldn't be bothered to dig latrines as well, so just went in their trenches, much to the horror of the international brigades. Soon they were wallowing in a joyful mixture of excrement and mud. Both sides' officers were little better than World War I generals. Their main tactic was throwing more and more men into the meat grinder, with only a few scraps of captured territory to show for the horrendous casualties. There was a brief moment in January where it looked like a nationalist breakthrough might occur, mainly due to sheer exhaustion on the Republican side. But the situation was saved by the heroism of the Germans of the Falman Brigade. Ordered by their commander, General Kleber, quote, "not to retreat a single centimetre under any circumstances," end quote. They followed his command to the letter. Only 35 lived to tell the tale, but the line held. By late January 1937, both sides were tired of the slaughter, and the fighting trailed off. While the Coruna Road had been closed, Madrid's supply lines were still open, and the battles had been costly failures for the Nationalists. Even worse, it was the elite Legion and Army of Africa that had taken most of the casualties, soldiers they could ill afford to lose. Meanwhile, further help was on the way. The Italians were entering the war in force. I do enjoy it when Mussolini appears in a story. Chaos, incompetence and bombast are sure to follow. The Spanish Civil War would be no exception. The Nationalists had only requested aircraft and pilots from Italy, but Mussolini, desperate for glory, insisted on sending a huge force. 50,000 fascist militia, many of who had been drafted or press-ganged, arrived in Spain. Having been told they were going to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, they arrived in Spain in midwinter wearing tropical uniforms. Because this is fascist Italy, of course they did. They were accompanied by some 660 aeroplanes plus pilots, 150 tanks, 800 big guns, and masses of other material. It would be independent of the Nationalist High Command, tasked with winning quick victories for the glory of the Duchy. They started off well, capturing the town of Malaga in the south, but this was a very easy target. Largo had been feuding with the defenders and starved them of ammunition, braying to his staff, quote, "Not a round more for Malaga," end quote. Meanwhile, his commander likely sabotaged the defence of the city to win Franco's favour, ordering a chaotic retreat that turned into a massacre. Overjoyed with his victory, the Duce agreed to aid yet another attempt to encircle Madrid. This time, the plan was better, at least on paper. It was meant to be a giant pincer movement, with a nationalist force advancing from the south of the capital across the river Jarama, cutting the Valencia road in the east that was the main artery for supplying Madrid. Meanwhile, the Italians would advance from the north of the capital, and they would meet up in the middle, cutting off Madrid completely. Yet it didn't go as planned from day one. The heavens opened and heavy rain delayed the redeployment of Italian troops after the Malaga campaign. Despite one of the vital pincers not being in place, an impatient Franco refused to delay. The Nationalists were going it alone. It would be a fatal mistake. Colonel Varela, Franco's field commander, had a formidable force under his control. 40,000 men, mostly elite Moroccan troops and legionnaires, backed up by German armour and a fleet of planes. Rather than the unimaginative meat assaults of the Corunna Road, they were already beginning to experiment with combined arms under the influence of their German advisors. Infantry, armour, planes and artillery working as one. That said, it was still very much in its infancy and by no means working perfectly. But Hitler's Spanish investment was already reaping a rich reward. The data and experience they were gaining here would help lead to Germany's early World War II successes. On the 6th of February, the rebels smashed their way forward in a storm of steel, artillery roaring. Here they halted, probing the defences, looking for a way to cross over the river. 2 key bridges were captured by Moorish troops, sneaking up and slaughtering the guards with their knives. I'm surprised you joined the army, Abdul. You fought the Spaniards back home. Your cousin smirks at you. I cut Spanish throats in the Rif. Now I do it on their home soil, and they even pay me for the privilege. What's not to like? Typical Abdul, you think, as you both laugh. Tonight, he will certainly get his wish. Your faces are darkened, and you keep low to the ground, silently making your way towards the railway bridge up ahead with 10 other Moroccans. Years of fighting in the mountains has taught you how to use every inch of cover to your advantage, to become a lethal shadow across open ground. The unsuspecting Reds are typically lax, amateurs playing at war. One stands guard, while others are curled up asleep. Abdul creeps up behind him, one hand covering his mouth, another thrusting a knife into his throat. Meanwhile, the rest of you slit the throats of the sleeping men. You creep along the bridge, killing the remaining sentries, and have just reached the other end, when suddenly shots ring out. You see a lone sentry running towards the command post. Cursing, you chase after him, only to see the Red pushing down on a plunger on a detonator. A huge explosion erupts, and the bridge leaps into the air. But, far from being destroyed, it just falls back into place. The horrified Red raises his gun at you, but only a dull click emerges. He starts babbling in a language you don't recognize. Abdul smiles. He's speaking French. Not as good a target as a Spaniard, but he will have to do. He advances on the unfortunate Frenchman with his already blood-stained knife. Taken by surprise by the Moors' commando raid, the Republicans tried to blow up the bridges, but thanks to poorly laid explosives, this failed. The Nationalists swarmed across. The only obstacle that now stood in their way was the Bajares and Pingarrin heights. If they controlled these, it would be easy to cut the vital Valencia road. Here is where the heaviest fighting and the worst bloodshed of the battle would occur. In the very heart of the fight was the British battalion, made up of a mixture of Brits, Irishmen, Australians, New Zealanders, and some Cypriots. It cannot be emphasized enough how unprepared they were. Most of the fighters had little training, probably only a few weeks. Some had only fired a rifle for the first time the previous day. They had no artillery, air, or tank support. They didn't even have maps or any idea where they really were. One survivor later claimed the brigaders didn't even know whether they were on the offensive or defensive. These poorly trained, poorly armed volunteers, most of whom had never left their homes before, were now the front-line defence against a well-equipped, trained and merciless assault by Franco's elite Moroccan troops. The defence initially proved a disaster. As they marched down into Harima Valley, they hadn't been told that the Nationalists had crossed the river and had now seized the Pingarrin Heights. Soon they saw Republican soldiers fleeing past them. Then gunfire began raking their lines. Men fell without even having fired a shot. Forced to retreat themselves, they took up positions on some nearby hills. To the left was White House Hill, after the white painted building on top of it. To the centre was a conical hill, and to the right lay a knoll. This whole area, but particularly the conical hill and White House Hill, would soon become known as Suicide Hill. That's how bloody this battle is going to be. To make matters worse, the machine gun company soon realised they'd been given the wrong ammunition, so it was left to the free infantry companies to hold off the assault alone. The attack by the Nationalists was unrelenting. Man after man fell, and the companies were decimated. Number 4 company fell back, as did Number 3. The hills, now held mostly by Number 1 company, came under constant heavy fire. According to one observer, so many bullets hit their position that, quote, thin grass and weeds on the crest of the hill were being slowly mown down, as if a gigantic scythe was passing and repassing, by bullets from the machine guns of the Moors and machine guns of the Germans, end quote. Still they hung on, under the leadership of Kit Conway, a former Irish Republican Army man.
There's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all know so well. It was there that we gave of our manhood, where so many of our brave comrades fell.
Bullets pound into the ground in front of you, your rifle burning hot as you return fire. Kit runs over, his face covered in dirt except for lanes carved out by the sweat running down his face. Headquarters is telling us we need to hold on at all costs. We're the only thing standing between the fascists and the road. You look around at your battered comrades. Jeff and Daly are dead. Pat Smith has blood streaming from his head and arm. The others aren't in much better shape. That's a suicide mission, Kit, you yell at him. He looks back at you grim, but determined. I know, but we have no choice. If they cut the road, it's all over. Join me on the crest. Shaking your head, you follow him further up the hill, bullets and shells erupting all around you, and start pouring fire into the advancing Moorish troops. Kit seems to be everywhere at once, giving out orders, encouraging the brigaders, and blasting away with his own rifle. Suddenly he shouts out. His rifle spins out of his hand, and he falls back. He's been hit. His voice is broken with agony as he says, "Do your best, boys. Hold on." Tears glisten in your eyes as he's taken away. Nationalist tanks are now rolling up the road to the right, while the Moors are sweeping in from the front and flanks. How could you hold out against all of this, with only a few weeks' training? But you won't let down Kit. You turn to the remaining brigaders. Do it for Kit. No pasaran. They shall not pass. A ragged shout goes up, and your bullets are soon raining down on Franco's minions. Like so many of the British Brigade that terrible day, Kit would die at Jarama. There's actually a memorial cairn to him there now that is part of the tourist trail of the battle. Forced to abandon their positions, the situation looked grim, but just as the Moroccan troops were coming over the hill, the machine gun company, which had managed to finally acquire the right ammunition, opened up. One survivor recounted that, quote, "You never saw a slaughter like it. They went down like corn," end quote. At the end of that first day, less than half the battalion remained. Political commissars had to intervene to convince some to stay and hold the line, normally with the threat of execution. The pressure continued the following day as the Dimitrov battalion of East Europeans and the Franco-Belgian battalions on their flanks drew further back, leaving the British Brigade surrounded on three sides. No. 4 Company panicked and retreated, leaving the machine gun company exposed. It was then surrounded and captured almost wholesale. They would later claim to have been surprised when a group of nationalist troops came up singing the Internationale. The third day of the battle began with the Nationalists advancing with a tank attack, forcing the British battalion to retreat. Quote, "The left flank broke and the rout spread to the whole line. The slaughter was terrible. One would see 5 men running abreast, and 4 of them suddenly crumple up." End quote. They fell back to a sunken road, where they were told that they were the only men between the Nationalists and the capture of the Valencia road. The decimation of the British battalion was horrific. On the morning of the 12th of February, they had been 600 men strong. By nightfall, there were only 225 survivors. By the 14th of February, only 140 were left. Yet, these remarkably brave men were not done fighting. They would lead a counterattack, along with Spanish and French reinforcements that retook some territory. It was enough to convince the Nationalists that Republican defences were stronger than they actually were. The front line stabilised and would remain in place until the end of the war. The British battalion had saved the day, but at a truly terrible cost. Both sides had taken horrendous losses, and their supply lines were close to snapping. It was a truly desperate situation for their troops on the ground. The Republican officers decided to launch more counterattacks while the Nationalists were weakened, which was a good idea. How they went about it, though, would lead to even more casualties. Inexperienced and often far too ideological officers sent men on doomed attacks over long stretches of open ground against entrenched defenders. They wouldn't have been out of place on the staff of General Haig during the Somme. The Soviet advisors were not much better, treating war like one of Stalin's ridiculous production targets back home. One tank commander lamented that, quote, "During the battles near Jarama, Battalion Commander Comrade Glaziev considered that the best crews were those that have fired off the most shells. Yet they were firing these shells while 3 kilometres away from the enemy." End quote. This lethal mixture of incompetence and ideological stubbornness led to a tragic disaster for the American Abraham Lincoln Brigade. This was mainly the fault of the Yugoslav Communist Commissar Vladimir Kopik, who had a penchant for seeing opera and staying away from the front lines. He was despised by just about everyone, described as, quote, "utterly unprincipled brute who would swear that black was white if it suited his convenience, and his only genius lay in his capacity for intrigue." End quote. He ordered the brigaders to attack well-entrenched Nationalist forces. They pleaded with him that advancing under such conditions was pointless, a death sentence, but he threatened to have them all shot for mutiny. He also promised that they would have artillery and air support, plus Spanish reinforcements. These were complete lies by Kopik. The brigaders were actually on their own. It was a massacre. Only 150 of the 263 men who went into battle were still standing the next day. The death of Charles Donnelly, an Irishman, became a famous legend. Crouched behind an olive tree as bullets ricocheted around him, he picked up a bunch of olives from the ground and started squeezing them. Then, in a quiet voice, he murmured, quote, "Even the olives are bleeding," end quote. A bullet hit him square in the temple just a few minutes later. What was left of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade mutinied. They were only kept quiet by being rotated out of the front lines. By late February, the fighting slowly ground to a halt and the line stabilized. The Nationalists held most of the heights, but the Republican defenses were now too strong to break through. It was a stalemate. The defenders now lived a monotonous existence in the damp olive groves. It was a life of rain-filled trenches, congealed stew, occasional deaths from the odd burst of firing, and useless attempts to get rid of lice in the seams of clothes. With the defeat at Jarama, Franco was finally forced to accept that it was going to be a long war. He didn't have the men to launch another great offensive around Madrid. He hadn't completely given up on surrounding the capital, allowing the Italians to launch their long-delayed attack. But for now, he needed more troops, better tactics, and a new strategy. A huge recruitment drive was launched in Morocco to replenish the Army of Africa, with promises of all the loot they could carry to tempt volunteers. From the mountains of the northwest emerged droves of Carlist monarchists to join Franco's forces, filled, according to one of their officers, with, quote, "faith in victory and faith in God, one hand holding a grenade, the other a rosary," end quote. The Germans also started training his officers, especially those from the Carlists and the Falangi. Out of these measures would emerge a far more formidable rebel army as the war raged on. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, the Republic wins its greatest victory, while Mussolini suffers his first humiliating defeat. A civil war within a civil war breaks out behind the Republican lines, while hell is coming to the Basque region, an all-consuming fire that would leave them devastated before it was done. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.